Albert Camus's The Stranger is not just a novel about a man who commits murder. It is one of the most important works of 20th century literature, a profound exploration of alienation, absurdity, and the meaninglessness of existence that helped define existentialism and continues to challenge readers' assumptions about morality, society, and what it means to be human. Published in 1942 in Nazi-occupied France, The Stranger shocked readers with its emotionally detached narrator and its refusal to provide moral judgments or easy answers. In today's video, we're diving deep into the strange, unsettling world of Meursault, exploring Albert Camus's life and philosophy and how they shaped this groundbreaking novel, analyzing the novel's themes of absurdity and alienation, examining its distinctive narrative style and shocking plot, and understanding why this brief tale of a man who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral and kills an Arab on a beach continues to provoke and fascinate readers more than 80 years after its publication. To understand The Stranger, we must first understand Albert Camus himself, one of the most influential and morally complex intellectuals of the 20th century. Born in 1913 in Mondovi, Algeria, then a French colony, Camus grew up in poverty in the working-class neighborhood of Belcourt in Algiers. His father, a French-Algerian agricultural worker, was killed in the First World War when Albert was less than a year old, and Albert never knew him. His mother was illiterate, partially deaf, and nearly mute, working as a cleaning woman to support Albert and his older brother. They lived in a two-room apartment with no electricity or running water, sharing the space with Albert's tyrannical grandmother and his uncle. Despite this impoverished background, Camus was brilliant and was noticed by his schoolteacher, Louis Germain, who recognized his talent and helped him win a scholarship to continue his education. This teacher's intervention changed Camus's life, giving him opportunities that his poverty would otherwise have denied. Camus would later dedicate his Nobel Prize acceptance speech to Germain, acknowledging the debt he owed to this man who believed in him. But Camus's working-class origins and his experience of poverty would shape his worldview and his writing throughout his life. Unlike many French intellectuals of his generation who came from bourgeois backgrounds, Camus understood intimately what it meant to be poor, to lack options, to live on society's margin. Camus attended the University of Algiers, where he studied philosophy and discovered his passion for ideas. But his studies were interrupted by tuberculosis, which he contracted at age 17. This disease would plague him throughout his life, causing periodic relapses and reminding him constantly of his mortality. The experience of facing death young, of understanding viscerally that life is fragile and can end at any moment, profoundly influenced Camus's philosophy. He became obsessed with the question of how to live meaningfully in a universe that is indifferent to human existence, where death is certain, and where there may be no ultimate purpose or meaning to anything we do. During the 1930s, Camus became involved in theater, journalism, and leftist politics. He joined the Communist Party briefly, but was expelled for his unwillingness to follow party orthodoxy. He worked as a journalist, writing about poverty and injustice in Algeria, including a famous series of articles about the desperate conditions in the Kabylia region that brought him both recognition and enemies. When World War II began, Camus tried to enlist but was rejected due to his tuberculosis. He moved to France during the war and became involved in the resistance, working for the underground newspaper Combat. It was during this period, while France was under Nazi occupation, that Camus wrote and published The Stranger, along with his philosophical essay The Myth of Sisyphus, which explored similar themes. The Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus are companion works, both exploring what Camus called the absurd. By absurdity, Camus meant the fundamental disconnect between human beings who desperately seek meaning and purpose, and the universe which is silent, indifferent, and provides no inherent meaning. We want life to make sense, we want our actions to matter, we want there to be justice and purpose, but the universe gives us no assurance that any of this is true. This recognition of absurdity, Camus argued, is the fundamental human condition. The question is how we respond to it. Do we commit suicide, concluding that life without meaning is not worth living? Do we take a leap of faith and embrace religion or ideology that provides artificial meaning? Or do we face the absurd honestly, acknowledge that life has no inherent meaning, and choose to live fully and authentically anyway? The Stranger is Camus's fictional exploration of these philosophical questions, embodied in the character of Meursault, one of the most unusual and controversial protagonists in world literature. The novel is divided into 2 parts and is narrated by Meursault himself in a flat, emotionless, almost journalistic style that is deliberately off-putting. The novel opens with one of the most famous first lines in French literature: "Mother died today." Or maybe yesterday. I don't know. I got a telegram from the home. "Mother, deceased. Funeral tomorrow. Faithfully yours." That doesn't mean anything. Maybe it was yesterday. This opening immediately establishes Meursault's character. His mother has died, yet he seems oddly detached, uncertain about when it happened, more focused on the ambiguity of the telegram than on his emotional response to the loss. Meursault travels to the old people's home where his mother had been living to attend her funeral. His behavior at the wake and funeral is described in meticulous detail, but what is most striking is his lack of conventional emotional response. He does not cry. He is more aware of physical sensations, the heat, his tiredness, his desire for coffee and cigarettes, than of grief. He observes other people's emotions but does not share them. He is irritated by an old woman who cries hysterically at the funeral, a woman he does not know who apparently befriended his mother. He notices these details with the same flat observational tone he uses for everything, as if his mother's funeral is no more significant than any other experience. The day after the funeral, Meursault goes swimming at the beach, where he encounters Marie, a former co-worker. They start a physical relationship, going to see a comedy film that very evening. When Marie asks Meursault if he loves her, he says it doesn't mean anything, but probably not. When she asks if he wants to marry her, he says he doesn't care, that he will marry her if she wants. This emotional flatness, this inability or refusal to express conventional feelings, characterizes all of Meursault's relationships. He is not cruel or deliberately hurtful, but he seems incapable of the emotional responses that society expects and that most people claim to feel. Meursault's neighbor Raymond is a pimp who beats his mistress and asks Meursault to help him with a scheme to humiliate her. Meursault agrees without any moral reflection, as if the question of whether this is right or wrong doesn't occur to him or doesn't matter. He writes a letter for Raymond designed to lure the woman back so Raymond can hurt her. When Raymond does beat the woman and the police get involved, Meursault testifies as Raymond's character witness. This leads to a confrontation with the woman's brother and his Arab friends. The conflict escalates, and Raymond, Meursault, and Raymond's friend Masson end up in a fight on the beach with the Arabs, one of whom cuts Raymond with a knife. Later that day, Meursault returns to the beach alone. It is intensely hot, and the sun is overwhelming, oppressive, almost a character in itself. Meursault encounters one of the Arabs who had fought with Raymond. The Arab has a knife. Meursault is carrying a gun that Raymond had given him earlier. In one of the most famous and analyzed scenes in modern literature, Meursault shoots the Arab. But he doesn't just shoot him once in self-defense. After the first shot, Meursault fires 4 more times into the motionless body. When he tries to explain this later, he says it was because of the sun, because of the heat, because everything was becoming unbearable. He cannot provide a rational motive, cannot explain his actions in terms that make conventional sense. The second part of the novel describes Meursault's imprisonment, trial, and eventual condemnation. The trial is the key to understanding Camus's critique of society and conventional morality. Meursault is on trial ostensibly for murder, but what he is really being judged for is his failure to conform to social expectations about emotions and behavior. The prosecution focuses less on the details of the killing than on Meursault's behavior at his mother's funeral. Witnesses testify that he showed no emotion, that he drank coffee and smoked, that he couldn't say how old his mother was, that he had sent her to a home rather than caring for her himself. The prosecutor argues that these facts prove Meursault has no soul, that he is a moral monster, that anyone who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral is capable of any crime. The trial becomes absurd and surreal. Meursault feels like a spectator at his own trial, as if it is about someone else. His lawyer tries to get him to express remorse, to show emotion, to perform the expected contrition, but Meursault cannot or will not do this. He tells the truth as he sees it, but his truth makes no sense within the court's framework. When asked if he regrets his action, Meursault says he feels more annoyance than real regret. This honesty, this refusal to perform expected emotions, seals his fate. He is found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. In prison awaiting execution, Meursault goes through various psychological stages. At first, he is preoccupied with the mechanics of execution, thinking obsessively about the guillotine and about whether there is any way to escape this fate. He thinks about legal appeals and the possibility of pardon, but gradually he comes to accept his death. In the novel's final pages, a chaplain visits Meursault's cell, trying to get him to repent and turn to God. Meursault explodes in rage, rejecting the chaplain's message and asserting that nothing matters, that everyone is condemned to death, whether by execution or by natural causes, that the universe has no meaning and no one's life is worth more than anyone else's. After this outburst, Meursault experiences a strange peace and even happiness. He thinks about his mother and realizes that at the end of her life, she too must have felt liberated by the nearness of death, free to live however she wanted because nothing mattered anymore. He opens himself to what he calls the gentle indifference of the universe and realizes that he has been happy and still is happy. The novel ends with Meursault hoping that on the day of his execution there will be a large crowd of spectators who will greet him with cries of hatred, so that he will feel less alone. The Stranger is a deeply philosophical novel, and understanding it requires grappling with Camus's concept of the absurd. Meursault is not meant to be a realistic character in the conventional sense. He is an illustration of what Camus calls the absurd man, someone who lives without illusions, who refuses to pretend that life has inherent meaning, who will not perform emotions he does not feel or accept conventions he does not believe in. In a world where most people live in what existentialists call bad faith, pretending that their lives have meanings that society or religion has provided, Meursault lives in radical honesty, acknowledging that nothing ultimately matters. But is Meursault admirable or monstrous? This question has divided readers since the novel's publication. Some see him as a hero of authenticity, someone who refuses hypocrisy and lives according to his own truth. Others see him as a moral monster, someone whose emotional flatness and inability to connect with others makes him inhuman. Camus himself said that Meursault refuses to lie, and that this is why society condemns him. In a world built on polite lies and social performances, someone who tells the truth appears monstrous. But Camus also acknowledged that Meursault is not a model to be emulated. He is limited, emotionally stunted, and his radical honesty has terrible consequences. The novel's treatment of colonialism and race is problematic and has been much debated. The Arab that Meursault kills is never named. He remains the Arab throughout the novel, a faceless figure rather than a fully realized human being. Camus has been criticized for this, for making the victim invisible while focusing entirely on the French colonizers' experience and psychology. The novel is set in Algeria, which was under French colonial rule, and the conflict between Raymond's group of French Algerians and the Arabs reflects real colonial tensions. But Camus does not examine these political and social dimensions explicitly. The murder seems almost accidental, motivated by heat and discomfort rather than by racial hatred, and the trial focuses on Meursault's character rather than on the fact that he killed another human being.
Some scholars argue that this erasure of the Arab victim is itself a political statement about colonialism, showing how colonial society dehumanizes the colonized to the point where their deaths barely register as significant. Others argue that Camus, who later became known for his opposition to Algeria's independence and his complicated relationship with colonialism, was simply blind to these issues, unable to see the Arab as fully human because of his own position within colonial society.
Whatever interpretation one accepts, modern readers must grapple with this troubling aspect of the novel. The novel's style is as important as its content. Meursault's narration is flat, emotionless, focused on physical sensations and objective observations rather than feelings. Sentences are short and declarative. Events are described but not interpreted. This style, sometimes called white writing or degree zero writing, was revolutionary in its time and influenced countless later writers. It creates a sense of alienation and detachment, making readers work to understand what Meursault is feeling, if he is feeling anything. The style embodies Camus's philosophy, presenting a world of facts without inherent meaning, where events happen but signify nothing beyond themselves. The sun and heat in the novel function almost as antagonists. The murder happens because of the sun, or so Meursault claims. The sun is blinding, oppressive, overwhelming. It represents the indifferent universe, the physical reality that does not care about human concerns or values. Meursault is more affected by physical discomfort than by moral considerations, and this prioritizing of the physical over the moral is part of what makes him so disturbing and so characteristic of the absurd worldview. The trial section of the novel is Camus's brilliant critique of how society creates meaning and enforces conformity. The court is not really interested in understanding what happened or why. It wants to fit Meursault into a comprehensible narrative, to make his actions make sense within society's moral framework. The prosecutor creates a story where Meursault is a cold-blooded monster who killed his mother by putting her in a home, who demonstrated his inhumanity by not crying at her funeral, and who therefore was capable of premeditated murder. This story is largely false, but it is a story that makes sense to the jury, that confirms their beliefs about how good and evil people behave. Meursault's actual motivations, which were not premeditated but rather stemmed from a moment of disorientation and discomfort, cannot be accommodated within this narrative framework. The novel suggests that society cannot tolerate genuine difference or authentic honesty. Meursault is condemned not for killing, at least not primarily, but for being different, for not performing the expected emotional responses, for not pretending to beliefs and feelings he does not have. The prosecution explicitly argues that Meursault's lack of emotion at his mother's funeral is connected to the murder, that both demonstrate the same soullessness. But Camus shows that this connection is created by the prosecution and the court, not inherent in the facts. The trial becomes a farce where truth is irrelevant and performance is everything. Meursault's encounter with the chaplain near the end crystallizes the novel's philosophical message. The chaplain represents religious faith, the traditional answer to life's meaninglessness. He offers Meursault the comfort of belief in God, in an afterlife, in ultimate justice and meaning. But Meursault violently rejects this offer. He asserts that he is certain of his life and his approaching death, and that this certainty is worth more than the chaplain's religious illusions. He declares that nothing matters, that everyone is condemned to death, that there is no ultimate meaning or justice. This rejection of false comfort, this facing of the absurd without illusions, is what Camus considers authentic existence. But immediately after this rejection, Meursault experiences something like peace and even happiness. He opens himself to what he calls the benign indifference of the universe and realizes that he is happy and has always been happy. This is the paradox at the heart of Camus' philosophy. Once you accept that life has no inherent meaning, that the universe is indifferent, you are freed from resentment and false hope. You can accept life as it is, can experience fully the physical reality of existence without needing it to mean something beyond itself. This is what Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, calls revolt. We acknowledge the absurd, but refuse to give in to despair or to embrace false solutions. We choose to live fully despite the absence of meaning, or even because of it. The ending, where Meursault hopes for a crowd of spectators greeting him with hatred, is deeply ambiguous. Why does he want this? Perhaps because being hated confirms his existence, his reality, his effect on others. Perhaps because he wants to feel connected to humanity, even if only through their hostility. Perhaps because he wants to affirm his difference, to go to his death as himself rather than as the penitent sinner society wants him to be. Camus leaves this final gesture open to interpretation, refusing to explain what it means. The Stranger was published in 1942 during the German occupation of France, and this historical context adds layers to its meaning. In a time of totalitarianism, when conformity was enforced violently and millions were being murdered for being different, a novel about a man condemned by society for his nonconformity and his honesty had powerful political resonance. The absurdity of Meursault's trial, where he is condemned for irrelevant reasons while his actual crime is almost ignored, parallels the absurdity of fascist justice systems. Camus's novel, while not explicitly political, can be read as a statement about the value of individual authenticity in the face of societies that demand conformity. The novel's influence on 20th century literature has been immense. Its style influenced the development of the Nouveau Roman in France and minimalist fiction in America. Its existentialist themes became central to post-war literature and philosophy. Writers from Samuel Beckett to Don DeLillo have acknowledged Camus's influence, The character of Meursault, the alienated protagonist who observes life without fully participating in it, became an archetype in modern fiction. The novel helped establish the idea that literary protagonists did not need to be likable or admirable, that literature could present morally ambiguous characters without judging them. The novel has been controversial since publication. Some readers are repelled by Meursault's coldness and see the novel as nihilistic and morally empty. Religious critics have attacked it for rejecting faith and meaning. Existentialists have debated whether Meursault truly embodies their philosophy or whether he is simply psychologically damaged. Post-colonial critics have condemned its treatment of Arabs and its colonial perspective. These controversies have, if anything, increased the novel's importance, making it a text that continues to provoke debate and strong reactions. The Stranger continues to resonate with modern readers because alienation and the search for authentic existence remain central concerns. In an age of social media performance, where people carefully curate their images and express emotions they may not feel to gain approval, Meursault's refusal to perform expected emotions seems both extreme and oddly relevant. His observation that much of what people say and do is meaningless social ritual, that conventions are arbitrary, speaks to anyone who has felt disconnected from the social world around them. The novel also addresses the fundamental existential questions that every thinking person must face. Does life have inherent meaning, or must we create our own meaning? Are we free to choose how to live, or are we determined by forces beyond our control? How do we face death and the certain knowledge that everything we do will eventually be forgotten? Is it better to live with comforting illusions or harsh truths? These questions have no final answers, but wrestling with them is part of what makes us human. Camus' relationship with existentialism was complicated. He was associated with existentialist writers and philosophers, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, and The Stranger is often taught as an existentialist novel. But Camus rejected the label, preferring to call his philosophy absurdism rather than existentialism. He disagreed with Sartre on political questions, and they eventually broke their friendship over Camus's refusal to fully support revolutionary violence. Camus received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957, when he was only 43, but he died in a car accident just 3 years later, in 1960, cutting short a brilliant career. Albert Camus's The Stranger is a masterpiece because it combines a deceptively simple story with profound philosophical depth. It creates in Meursault one of the most unusual and challenging protagonists in world literature, a character who forces us to question our assumptions about emotion, morality, and what makes us human. It examines fundamental questions about meaning, authenticity, and how to live in an absurd universe with unflinching honesty. It is written in a revolutionary style that perfectly embodies its philosophical concerns. It critiques social conventions and the human tendency to create false meanings and demand conformity. And it offers, in its strange way, a vision of how to live authentically and even happily in a world without inherent meaning, by accepting the absurd and living fully in the present moment. Thanks for watching this deep dive into Albert Camus's The Stranger. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of the most influential and challenging novels of the 20th century, don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment below with your thoughts on The Stranger, whether you find Meursault sympathetic or monstrous, or which classic work you'd like me to explore next. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep exploring the works of literature that challenge us to think deeply about existence, meaning, and what it means to live authentically.